Welcome, my name is Catherine Berlinger, and this teaching tip is about getting involvement through questions. And we know both from the research into teaching and from our experiences in other areas, investigations, parenting, helping even a friend with challenges, that the ability to ask questions that elicit good answers is a crucial skill. So in looking at what makes a good question, there are 5 variables that we can take into account. And these variables are that the question should require manipulation of course content. If students see that the questions the teacher is asking are not directly related to how they're going to learn the materials, get the marks, do more successful work in their future career, then you don't have buy-in from the very beginning. So first of all, it should require manipulation of course content. Secondly, Dewey, back in 1944, talked about the fact that our questions as teachers should mirror those that the students have in their minds, so that we're actually just facilitating them getting their questions asked and making it comfortable so that as time passes they will ask them themselves. Thirdly, they should feature HOTS. HOTS is the short form for higher order thinking skills. If you Google HOTS, you'll see a lot of research in the younger years of schooling about HOTS and how that makes for successful teaching. In post-secondary, we need to understand that students want a bit of a challenge in the question, not simple recall questions. Fourthly, they should be open rather than closed so that there is a variability in answers possible, and they should provide time for reflection. We'll talk about that both in the answering and after the answering. When I'm working with novice teachers and talking about question answering in the class, 2 situations that come up fairly frequently are the following. First of all, the faculty member will say they ask a question in the class and nobody comes up with an answer. So they're feeling themselves looking desperately around for someone to rescue them, or they just answer themselves, both of which are not really effective. And secondly, sometimes a student will answer your question with something that is not what you were expecting and throws you off a little bit. So how can you respond to an answer to your question when the donation from the class is not the donation that you were expecting? And I find that really thinking through your question episodes in advance can help. And once you've done that for however many hours it takes for you to become more expert at it, you'll find that it's a real pleasure to have that question and answering period in the class, or periods. I think we need to be patient and teach our students to ask the type of good questions that will help them to learn the material we're teaching. So I often plan a set of questions that a student could ask about the material. I started doing this when I was teaching English as a second language because I recognized that students from many different educational backgrounds had not experienced the way question and answering occurs in the Canadian post-secondary education system. But I found also when I went into teaching college-level communications courses that many students straight out of high school or students who've been out of school for a long time can use some facilitation in the questioning and answering process. So I plan a set of questions that a student would ask about the material, and I really rely on my own confusion as I learned. For example, I teach a course that involves a lot of linguistics, and I look back on my university career in learning linguistics, and I think about the things that really confused me. What questions would I have liked to ask about the material at that time? I also keep a little database, a file of questions that students struggle with on tests, and ways that I could lead them towards the test questions and answers by practicing that in class. I even type those up and put them on slides sometimes and say, would someone like to read this question? That way I can't fail to stop and have a little interaction interlude. And when I'm preparing my evaluations, I will use recreations of the same questions. And like other faculty members, I sometimes give a database of possible test questions in advance so students can work through them and study them. And then I choose a sample from that set. If you're not in the mood for coming up with questions yourself, you can have your students do the work and come up with questions for you to ask. I'll give them the topics for the day at the start and 5 minutes to work in teams with cue cards. And on the cue card, they'll put 2 to 4 questions that they think might be useful about the topic that's coming up. I use this as my pre-assessment to see what they're thinking of and what they know. And I also use it so that we have a set of questions to be asked during the presentation and afterwards. Sometimes I'll sort the questions in order of how the class will flow, and I'll either periodically ask them myself or have the students ask them. At other times, I'll have them keep the cards and ask them when they think it's the most pertinent time to do so. If you look back at the teaching tip that had to do with effective teaching presentations, there was a discussion of transmission modes and transformation modes in teaching and learning. And we mentioned that many students come into post-secondary for the first time more in a transmission mode. So if you have them prepare questions, they may be more about factual information or recall. And we would definitely want to move students to be able to talk in depth about the subject matter because that's the level they'll need to be at when they move into working in the field. So I'll try and ask or encourage students to ask a range of questions that feature a need for higher order thinking skills, or HOTS. They're needing to describe, compare, contrast, question, hypothesize, etc. So, for example, I can ask questions about the where, what, how, and when of the topic, leaving some room for opinion. For example, I can say, in your group's thinking, what are 3 criteria we should compare X and Y on? I try to keep the questions open for the most part. Closed questions where only one answer is correct can cause students to hesitate to contribute. For example, if you ask, what did the textbook say about this, or what did the case study say about this, number one, they may not have prepared adequately for the class. And number two, when there's only one right answer, we always are afraid that we haven't remembered correctly. So some openness is a benefit in the classroom. Be sure to ask a number of questions that offer insights into generational, geographical, cultural, and political aspects. We know that students are coming to our classroom from many diverse backgrounds. So we could ask, for example, why would we find this particular woodworking process in place now in 2011 rather than in the Ontario of the 1950s? Would we expect this process to be occurring in the United States or in China as well? Well, why not, etc. So by broadening the questions and the openness of them, as long as they're tightly tied to subject matter, we have really rich discussions in the classroom. A couple of pointers that I found really helpful in the classroom too are to make sure that you give students time to read or listen to the question. I say, I'm not going to take any answers generally until a full minute has passed. I want you to kind of give due respect to the question and have an opportunity to think. And often I'll use a think, pair, share at that point where I say take a minute to think, turn to a partner and compare your answers, and then I'm going to get 3 responses from the classroom. This allows the question to be answered in a way that's really useful for learning because the students have had a chance to reflect. If you look cross-culturally at questioning and timing in class, you'll find that there are some cultures where teachers' questions are rare, need to be accorded thoughtful respect, and are not even answered until at least 15 seconds have passed in silence. This is again to show respect for the question. So I try to avoid the trivial pursuit method of questioning where, the fastest, brightest student throws up their hand and gets to answer. I want the students to reflect upon answering, and I think when you do more and more of this, you'll see unexpected hands and hear unexpected offerings in the classroom. And it's another reason why sometimes conducting the conversation about the questions online can be helpful because the quieter student is sometimes quite surprising in what they offer. So give a think, pair, share of some sort with the question so that the students can reflect. So in order for students to really value the question times and teachers to grow in their teaching from it, I think we need to make the question time gold. So I do this by limiting the opportunities and occasions so that I will not have students throwing their hands up all the time. If there's something pressing, they're always welcome to, but I actually put slides into my PowerPoint presentation that say something like interaction, interlude, or question time so that students learn that there will be that opportunity and will really enjoy it. I often limit the number of questions to 3 and then take more if it's necessary, but I don't want the students to think that there's going to be a long question time because that can frustrate some of them. The format, as I mentioned, is constrained to some degree. I have them come up with the questions so that they're better questions. And you can also limit the audience reaction. So I'll say sometimes I'll get one comment, I'll get the question here, I'm going to answer it, and then let's get 2 other people to comment on that. So at the beginning, I'll often say something like, let's get 3 people from 3 different parts of the room to each ask a question or make a comment about a specific topic that I've talked about. A student will respond first, and then I'll add my comments. And one thing I can't overemphasize is don't move on without getting your 3 questions or your 2 comments. The class will see you standing there solidly waiting, and they will learn to offer up their questions and their contributions. And really too often novice teachers say, any questions? They'll get none and they'll move on. And they say, this is really frustrating. My biggest piece of advice is just wait. And we all know that there will be awkward questions and there will be awkward comments. And I think really here we have to not betray angst. I remember reading one research study of post-secondary teachers in the US where they actually showed that the teacher would step back on one foot towards the board when they got a question that they were afraid of, and that the expert teachers, the teachers who were comfortable, would move forward slightly towards the class when that question was asked to show that all donations are welcome. It becomes less fun. It becomes less fun to confuse you and less embarrassing to be the student asking the wrong question if you are always welcoming of what comes up. So, but you do need to buy yourself some time because you've got to have something to say. And what I usually say is, how did you arrive at your question? How did you arrive at your comment? How did you arrive at your conclusion? This gives me a little bit of time, but it also gives me insight into what the student is basing their item on. Most often, students are not trying to be difficult. They are confused, they're needing some attention, and by finding out the etymology of their question or their comment, I have time to come up with a response that will help to meet their needs. So I hope this has been helpful for you for thinking about questions and answering in the classroom, and thank you very much.